Hi, listeners. Welcome back to the Outside Context. And we're a little sorry about the delay, but we'll explain to you why that happened.
Hi, everyone, and hi, Elise. Yes, I think this is the longest we've gone since the beginning of the outside context, which was actually almost a year ago now, in not recording an episode, mainly because life just got in the way. I went on summer holidays. I think Elise went on summer holidays. I had a whole dream of recording an episode from a Thai beach, but once I got to the Thai beach, I really rethought my priorities, and that didn't happen.
As,
All
as
right.
you should. I also went on holiday to Spain, and again, Spanish pools, beaches, eating a lot of chiporones. I wasn't really like, let's record an episode. But we're back now. And as Jannah said, we're so excited that we've actually done a year of the outside context. This will be our 13th episode. And we really wanted to do something special for this one. And so, for those who don't like our outside context moments, this is not going to be the episode for you because we are going to go through an outside context moment, but then we're also going to do a little look back at the rest of the episodes, some of the themes that have come up. And of course, we wanted to use some technology to do that. So we did some deep research with ChatGPT on our own podcast and got it to ask us some questions back. So really excited to get into that. But first, Jannah, what is our joint outside context moment this week?
I think as well, this is going to be a bit marmite for some people. Not all of you we appreciate will want 5 to 10 minutes of Elise and I talking about Alien Earth. And yet here we are. So we have both been watching Alien Earth. We both had a lot of thoughts and feelings about it. And we both wanted to use it as our outside context moment this week. Now, I think the world is broadly divided into three groups of people when it comes to the alien universe. The ones who genuinely just don't care and don't understand what the fuss is. The ones who think that they are a perfectly acceptable and entertaining franchise of horror movies. And the third who look for the meaning of it all and see the deep social commentary in each installment from the Alien franchise. And I think you know which camp we fall into.
There's probably a fourth as well of people that don't like sci-fi or the alien films whatsoever. Shout out to my father-in-law who's not a sci-fi fantasy fan. However, please stick with us because, as Jannah said, there is actually really interesting messages in this series. Should we start with the trillionaires? Because I think that's one of the main things.
So I think we should start with a vague spoiler alert. We'll try not to give away the main plot points here, but we are going to give away some information that's fairly, I think, might be revealed in the first few minutes of the first episode, because that's fairly important, and talk more about the world building and some of the themes that have emerged. So yes, this is the future. I think it's about 100 years from now, and that's quite specifically chosen. And the tech trillionaires, as they are at this point in time, have, and there are 5 of them, in a sort of dystopian, post-tech dystopian Orwellian future, rather than 3 global powers emerging. It's 5, and each of them controls a specific area of the Earth, and it's kind of the background to that corporate enslavement vision that you see play out in the Alien franchise overall.
And I think the other interesting thing that I saw out of this, and it was a sort of very throwaway comment at one point, I think in the first episode, where they're talking about the 5, so the 5 trillionaires, and they say, and someone's asking a younger person, like, oh, well, how did the 5 come to be? And someone says, well, they had so much power and control, and they decided the governments weren't doing a very good job anymore and that they could do a better job. And so they just took control. And I thought that was first, it's a brilliant premise for everything else that happens in the show. But second, it does hit a little bit close to home when you see how a lot of tech billionaires insert themselves into the fabric of society in the US in particular at the moment, into government and into decisions on the geopolitical stage as well. And I think it really doesn't feel that far away from our reality. As you said, like it's something that feels plausible for 100 years in the future. And there are obviously different personas of the trillionaires. They are very different from one another, but the way that they behave is also so careless on one hand, but also ruthless with the lives of both other humans and of life forms in general, which I think is a good setup for a lot of the other things you then see play out in the rest of the series.
Yeah, and I think what you see as well is that there's very tight information control happening in the populations of each of these main geopolitical areas. You can see that they're not exposed to, very much, if any, news from other areas, that there's very little cross-fertilization in terms of knowledge or population or anything like that. And you also see this development of a society in which everyone serves ultimately the corporation that controls their region. So it's almost like a system of indentured labor. Your education, your job, your life prospects are determined by your service to, or what is seen as the value that you provide the corporation that you're aligned with. Yeah, so I think, you touched on another of those key themes there, which is around how they use technology differently, and each of them has a different vision. Again, this is revealed in about the first 30 seconds. So each of them has a different vision for the future of humanity. One sees, the future of humanity being AI based, another about uploading human consciousness to massive computers, and one of the factions that we see the most of is looking at uploading human consciousness into artificial bodies. And this leads to some interesting ethical questions as well. And of course, when we throw in the aliens, again, not a spoiler, you might have guessed from the name that they do turn up.
There are aliens in it. Surprise.
There are all sorts of questions that come up around, life, this kind of self-sovereignty concept, how much autonomy and control and sovereignty do we have over our bodies, the connection between body and mind, or body and soul, as it were, and who determines what life has value.
And then building on that, another thing that I think is really fascinating and tied to an interesting article that we have been reading lately is I think there's also an interesting theme about the commodification of life and the commodification of procreation and one's progeny and children. And again, not a spoiler because you will figure this out in literally the first episode, but there is a very strong theme to think about how we also consider the next generation. And one of the trillionaires in particular doesn't really see anything wrong with this commodification of basically a child's life and extending that for scientific purposes or their own purposes and also using them for their own gain. And the reason I bring that up as well as Edna mentioned the article is that Jannah and Helen and I had actually all read this really interesting article about the commodification of surrogacy in Silicon Valley and these essentially, I don't really want to say breeding programs, but that is kind of how it comes across in the article about the ultra rich and often on the kind of tech billionaire side wanting to sort of be able to procreate in a way that doesn't also inconvenience them. So through surrogates and also to be able to choose a lot of the characteristics that those children will have and line these things up perfectly. And I think that obviously I want to put a disclaimer to say that there are also many really very legitimate reasons why people might choose surrogacy. I myself was adopted. there are many different ways to go about procreation and building a family. However, specifically this article, and we'll link it in the comments, is about that commodification element. And this also comes across really strongly in Alien Earth. And you see a lot of adults using children to basically experiment and to, as Jannah said, to push forward their own vision of what the future of society will look like and what the future of humanity they think that should be. And I think that that was really it's really scary, I think, at points in the show when you see it, and really chilling the way that they use children.
Yes, definitely. And I think, back to the article as well, one of the key themes that was very strongly emerging was not only the commodification of children and childbearing, but the control that is exerted over the service provider of the surrogacy. So the women in this context. And this regression of women to, just biological vessels for carrying children, which is quite terrifying to see that, coming through in the social context when there are legislative backlashes against women's reproductive rights and things like that. But anyway, we're already 10 minutes into the episode, and let's get cracking with our retrospective, Elise.
All right, but last call. Everyone should watch Alien. I won't give too many spoilers about the actual aliens in Alien Earth because I think you should watch that for yourself. But my view is one of the best parts of the Alien franchise. So go watch it and please let us know if you do. But yes, let's start with a look back because I think that, again, there's a lot of these themes that we can continue to explore. And the first one, which is very directly related, that ChatGPT asked us to think about, it comes under the broad umbrella of technology and power, and specifically empowerment versus control. And it noted that a lot of times when we talk to our guests, we say that technology can be a force for empowering individuals, like the self-sovereign digital ID episode, for example. And it said that we come across broadly as tech optimists, which, to be honest, actually is a little bit flattering because I feel like I'm quite cynical about it some days. But it did ask us to consider, like, what is the risk of a lot of the tools and good things we talk about in the episodes being co-opted for control and oppression, and what safeguards might be needed or structures to ensure that tech actually empowers people rather than undermines their autonomy. Any thoughts on that, Jannah?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when we look at the pace of change of, technology and technological development, and also the impact that technological development is having on our society at the moment, one thing that really stands out is the lack of any kind of thought or planning that's gone into how this evolution should take place and how this incorporation of technological change into our society and our economy should happen. And it's super interesting. I've had some conversations with people where, the Industrial Revolution has come up. And, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a massive change in, the way people interacted with each other and the way they interacted with employers, etc. Even in the way, families interacted with each other. In one sense, we have this concept of the nuclear family today, being as prevalent as it is and as embedded in our social structure because of the Industrial Revolution and the kind of tearing apart of extended family frameworks and extended family, not only social structures, but also, economic structures and things like that, as people had to move to where employment was. And that's happening at a different kind of scale now. And it's kind of disturbing, not only because it's changing the way that we live our lives and engage with each other, but also because it has, when it comes to AI, an impact on the way we think and the way we perceive the world. I don't know what the answer is entirely. While tech policy is something we both work a lot on, it's mainly still something that's reactive. In very few instances is it proactive. And I'd love to see more governments and more happening at the supranational level from organizations like the World Economic Forum or the United Nations, or, indeed some of those supranational regulatory bodies and the OECD, etc., coming together and looking at emerging technology challenges, opportunities, and what society might look like. Because at the moment, the only people who are really doing that are sci-fi authors. I know we covered this.
And it's a little bit depressing with the look ahead. It's not, I mean, they're giving us a lot of warnings. I don't know if anyone is heeding them.
Yeah. Like at the moment, we have an education system that wasn't even fit for purpose to, produce young adults, young people who are able to cope with the pace of change in technology and society as it was 5 years ago. With the advent of AI, where we have no idea what the future in which they emerge blinking from the education system into the light is going to look like. And the one thing we do know is that they're not going to be adequately prepared for it because we're not.
And yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that, I mean, I definitely don't have an answer either, but maybe I would pull back one thing that Haviva said in our latest episode with her, which is that on a smaller scale, and I do think the supranational bodies need to have a look, but on a smaller scale, I think we as individuals, this is where it's really important that we keep being critical and that we keep pushing back, and that when and bear in mind, like, this is not, I am not talking about mass protests against central bank digital currencies and digital ID, like both things that I think both a lot of people know that Jannah and I are broadly supportive of. But I am talking
about implemented correctly.
If implemented correctly. And that's exactly what I mean. I think we as a society probably need to be less readily accepting of the tech offered up on a platter to us and think a little bit more about, who is going to have access to my data if I use this? What is it being used for? I think we need to care a little bit more. And I think that we've, as a society, really gotten out of the habit of caring. And it's a lot of commodification of everything. And everything is a fun thing to have or to win or to get. And it's not actually always going to end up so fun. And so I think we need to care more about the tech that we use, because then it will be less likely to be able to be used to oppress us.
Yes, we end up in techno-corporate dystopia when not enough of us care. Yes.
This brave new world.
Yeah. Okay, so another thing that ChatGPT identified as a theme to explore was this question of who benefits and who's left behind. So when we're envisioning futures like AI-driven finance or smart cities, or, even the question that we always ask everyone about multiplanetary society, who do we see as the primary beneficiaries? Again, this leads on from, this comment to private industry. So private industry is increasingly dominant in ventures like space exploration. And we've seen that that's a remarkable change, actually, over, since the advent of space exploration, which was originally driven by the space race, but it was, government backed. And therefore, it reflected the values of the societies of the countries that were engaging in the space exploration. And there was a genuine, I think, whether it was the US or the Soviet Union, there was a genuine desire for exploration and collaboration rather than exploitation of resource, which is what we see as we move into more of the private sector space exploration initiatives. So we already know as well that wealth concentration today yields outside political influence, and that this has a bearing on who controls these emerging industries. So, Elise, how do we address concerns that some of these innovations might mainly benefit elites, whether it's, big tech companies or wealthy individuals and major investors, while others are left behind? And how can we make sure, how can we help create an environment in which the benefits of tech revolutions that are happening are broadly shared and that they don't deepen inequalities? Small question
Ooh,
for you.
yeah. What a question. I mean, first, from pretty much the history of wealth and the dawn of that kind of economic wealth creation, I think that inevitably the elites are going to benefit from the tech revolution. Like, unfortunately, that is going to happen, and it's already happened and continues to happen. So I think the question is it like, how do we make that stop? Because that's, as I said, I think that that's not necessarily something that will occur. And also, to be fair, I will note that we've had some interesting episodes, like with Per Wimmer, when he discussed that there can be a lot of benefits to private space exploration and to private industries getting involved in these things. And sometimes they can find solutions more quickly and more efficiently and bring a lot of that research back to the rest. And so I guess what I would focus on is, you asked about how do we make sure that inequalities don't deepen and how do we make sure that everyone can be a beneficiary as well. And so I guess this is probably tied to my last answer about, how we need to care more. We don't only need to care more and be a bit more cautious and a bit more critical, but we need to care more in that we also need to be training ourselves. Like, we need to make sure that we're actually using the technology and that, we need to make sure that we are training up the next generation as well and not just the wealthy next generation. So I actually think that a big push in my mind, and you mentioned the education system before, tech has to be a part of the education system starting from a very young age. Like, the jobs of the future are and already are going to be different. I've had multiple conversations with big companies across London in the professional services sector who've noted that they are going to be hiring less analysts at a junior level because they're using AI more and using more tech tools. That means that those entry level jobs, the next generation of students, of interns, school children, we need to be preparing them because that's how we make sure that these inequalities don't deepen for the elites and for their children. Like, they will be fine and they will probably get a job anyways, and it will probably occur through nepotism. And also, they will have a lot of access to
Such
this
a positive
technology.
vision. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be realistic here. But I think if we want to not have the inequalities deepen and also enable people to have social mobility, they need to be empowered to use the technology from a young age as well.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, is definitely something that for me I think about. And I don't know, I know obviously you have a young son and you must think about it a lot as well, but I think that it's hard to fight the tide, and I think that we need to then think about how can we make the lives of those who already are facing inequalities better, and how can we empower them to use more technology. And also, frankly, for those of us who are in jobs in financial services and in tech, we need to be really intentional about helping the next generation, about identifying opportunities for them, about, you know, speaking to them about the realities of the job market. Like, I think it does come down to people as individuals as well to try to do their part to reduce inequalities. So I feel like I've got a lot of thoughts in this episode about what we should be doing as individual people.
I think what's super interesting as well is, we in the UK we had a big overhaul of our education system a few years ago under the last government. It shifted to being more intentionally a knowledge-based education system. So a huge emphasis on children learning knowledge, absorbing information. And when we look at, the skills that are needed in environment in which knowledge is available at your fingertips. The knowledge is out there. Like, it's the last thing everyone needs to know some basic skills and stuff like that. But ultimately, we should be teaching children not loads of facts and figures, but how to find the facts and figures, how to sift through different sources, especially in an AI environment, and figure out what's true and what's not. So it's that critical thinking, it's that ability to find out things for themselves. And then it's also about, rather than teaching them to be the workforce of the future, which I feel like in particular the English education system is very geared up to, it's teaching them that they may be creating the jobs of the future. Look at what we do today. I mean, none of what we do would have been on anyone's list, career opportunities list as a teenager finishing school. You don't, as a 5-year-old think, I would like to work in policy advocacy and financial innovation.
I would like to yap about regulation, but also technology with a lot of my friends on a daily basis. I mean, I don't know, maybe some of that, but probably not that specific.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I think, we have to rethink what how the skills that we're teaching children and the expectations that they should have. The jobs we have didn't exist when we were growing up. The jobs that they will have, don't exist today. And it's about that creativity and critical thinking and I think ability to exploit opportunities that's going to be really key in reducing future potential for inequality.
Mm. Okay, so now I want to move to the next theme, which was future visions and also ethics. So I'm going to start with actually something that I thought was a good reflection and get your thoughts on it. So it said, obviously, over the course of the podcast, we have tried to highlight both excitement about innovation, but also critiques. It asks us if we've discovered any internal contradictions in our own worldviews through these conversations. So, obviously, championing both decentralization and individual empowerment, but we also obviously engage with venture capitalists and private entrepreneurs who drive these innovations. And so, it's asked us how we reconcile some of those anti-establishment ideals but and like challenging authorities, but also working within, and I think this comes back to what I was saying before, within those existing capitalist frameworks that both fund and build a lot of these technologies. So like, what do you think? Are there any blind spots or contradictions you notice for yourself? And how have you thought about that as we've went through the episodes?
I mean, I feel like for you and I, this is where we live these days. I mean, this is just where we live and
True.
breathe every day is in the tension and the contradictions and the gray areas between traditional finance and concepts of money and economics and this emerging new space, crypto, decentralization, decentralized finance, and things like that. And I would say that we're both pretty moderate in this spectrum. We're very centrist people. We are not on either side. We're kind of trying to plot a way forward through the tensions that emerge. So I think this does have an impact on how you and I perceive and discuss these future concepts because we can see, the political ideologies that motivate thinking on both sides of the spectrum. And how they can give rise to certain types of future. So if you are a pure free markets capitalist, then ultimately, you can try all you want, but it's not going to end up in a utopian future of in which everyone has access, has, equity and equality, etc. It's going to end up in more of that techno-capitalist kind of future. And yet, when you speak to most free market capitalists and you figure out what is exactly is motivating them, it is this kind of techno-utopian idea. And it's really interesting. I think, probably a lot of people in the space should be a little bit more cross and interdisciplinary in their reading of history and economics and, science. But we are in a heavily, ideological space. And similarly, when we look at people who are primarily motivated by this vision of, complete social equity, historically, interestingly, I think we have seen a pivot here because historically, that kind of vision could only have been created through highly centralized power structures. So socialism, communism, the Soviet Union, Cuba, etc., that kind of thing could only be, imposed centrally and controlled centrally. Whereas now we're seeing and we're having these conversations with people who see the potential for decentralization of governance, of power structures, etc., to give rise to the same outcomes. And that's a super interesting shift. And also the fact that that can be a shift that's driven from the ground up as well.
Yeah.
It doesn't, and it has to be a shift that's driven from the ground up. So I think, ideology is evolving and changing over time, and that's super interesting.
And
Yeah.
hopefully we're evolving with it. But no, I think that I would agree with that. And you're right. Like both of us in our day jobs, it's very important that, especially when working on future regulatory frameworks, that we are very neutral and centrist and we're trying to think about things that are genuinely future proof. And so I would definitely agree with that. I think that for me, one of the biggest blind spots that people probably noticed in the episode that I identified was when talking about disinformation and misinformation. And I think definitely my tendency after probably some years of exhaustion is like not to really confront that. Like if I see that someone is sharing something that I perceive to be disinformation or misinformation, or perhaps I can even look it up and see that it is, I'm like, well, I might text Jannah about it, but I'm probably not going to go to the person that shared it and be like, hey, can I talk you through this? And I think that that was one for me that I definitely felt a bit of conviction on, where it was like, oh, like I have these hopeful visions for the future as well. I really want us to work towards a protopia. I read so many dystopian sci-fi books that I'm like, oh, I hope we don't go down that route. But then I was like a little bit convicted about the fact that I was not probably doing my bit to contribute. And so, again, when I was talking about all this stuff earlier about how we need to care more and we need to be more critical, that definitely applies to my own life as well. And I want to do that for, myself, my friends, my family. I want us to be having those kind of engaging conversations, even obviously when we disagree. So I think that was one for me. But I agree. I actually think that one thing that I love about the podcast in general and the guests that we have is that they have come from such diverse perspectives. You can probably tell when you're listening to the episodes that they have probably varying different political views as well, and different views about how we approach government structures and governance too. And what's been great is that I feel like you and I have actually been able to relate to all of them in different ways. And in some ways, I don't think that has to be contradictory, because if we think about the future world that we're aiming to build towards and build for, it likely will be a mix. Well, it hopefully will be a mix of the best aspects from all of those. Like you can have venture capital and you can also have digital ID that is self-sovereign and people having, control of their data. Like those things are actually not contradictory and we can work towards both of those worlds. And so I thought that was definitely an interesting one.
Yeah, I was just, going to move on to the next topic because I think that segues in really nicely. And that's, you touched on ethical capitalism and the ability to have ethical capitalism. And, any kind of better future must also be a sustainable one, and one that does work for the majority of people, because sustainability is not just about environmental sustainability, it's social sustainability as well. Like the stability of our social structures and our political systems depends on most people being pretty satisfied with their lives. And when this kind of fabric starts developing little tears and holes, then we have social unrest. So, how do we weigh environmental and ethical responsibilities against this drive for technological progress? And are they actually at odds? So, Erica Nisfold, for example, told us that failing to solve ethical issues in low Earth orbit and in, sort of our early space travel initiatives doesn't bode well for environmental justice further out in space when we start, engaging in interplanetary travel, exploration, and exploitation of resources further out in the solar system and beyond. And she talked as well about how that reflects how we've handled and how we've perceived things here on Earth, and particularly how, the legacies of colonialism and concepts of colonialism, the dominant thinking of, the colonizer approach to exploration, impacts how we think about space exploration and other projects. So, one thing I find really interesting when we think about this is, people think sometimes that chasing one type of ambitious project, whether it's space travel or whether it's, revolutioning our financial system or whatever, might distract from something else like climate change. And these are not mutually exclusive. This isn't necessarily a zero-sum game. In terms of, how do we ensure that progress doesn't outrun our capacity to do what's right, both for people and the planet? How do we create motivations? How do we create the right incentives for technological progress to also be aligned with positive environmental and social outcomes?
So, as you were talking about that, I actually want to come back to something we were talking about with Alien Earth, which was information control. And how in Alien Earth, there's very tight information control, and people don't really have visibility into what's the grand vision of these trillionaires. What are they trying to do with the aliens? What are they trying to do with human consciousness? How do we solve these big questions? And I would contrast that into today's world where we have information overload, but also, as we were just talking about, lots of misinformation and disinformation. I think that one of the ways in which we could work towards better social and ethical sustainability is to have good and verifiable information available to as many people as possible. So actually helping the world, governments, jurisdictions to understand some of these issues better. And frankly, we as people working in the digital and tech industry can be better about that. We can be better about explaining some of these technological changes to governments. We can be better about explaining them to our family and friends. And we can be better about information sharing, which I think is really important. Like, to take it back to the world of like cryptocurrencies, a big criticism of the cryptocurrency industry is that a lot of the general public have no clue what the crypto industry is on about. There's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of jargon, and there's a lot of noise. And
And vast sums
extrapolate
of
that.
money can be made and lost in minutes.
Yes, exactly, which is scary to people, and understandably. There's a lot of things that are scary about other industries as well. Like when we had the episodes where we talked about space, for example, there was a lot of terms that when we did the prep calls, I was like, okay, I'm going to need to go and look that up and look into that a little bit more. And so I actually think that my one, and I don't obviously have the solution to everything, but my one point about how we do get to a more sustainable future is we need to have better information and not so tightly controlled information. And we need to find a way for it to be verifiable to people so that they can trust it. And maybe some of that does come with digital ID and better verification methods over time, and better verification methods for what we read and hear and see online. So I think it's possible, but I think that would really go a long way to instilling trust in people when we see these technological evolutions. But what do you think?
I actually was coming at it from a very different angle,
Go for it.
a much more practical one. I mean, here's me taking the side of free markets and capitalism. But I think actually market dynamics have, we've seen lately that market dynamics actually can have an interesting effect and interesting outcomes when applied to some of these goals of sustainability and social equity and things like that. So, on the sustainability side, for example, you know, since central banks woke up to the fact that climate change is real and that there's a real impact, to the insurance industry, to, transition risks as we transition to clean energy, as and the risks inherent in not transitioning as well. And, climate change aside, what happens as resources become more expensive or harder to access and things like that. And also the constraints that a lack of, cheap, available, renewable energy has on our ability to adopt incredibly energy intensive new technologies such as AI, such as distributed ledger technology, such as cloud computing. That's when actually sustainability moved up the agenda and became, a major risk issue for central banks, moved up the agenda of governments, and regulation started to be introduced, not because of a touchy-feely, fluffy, caring about polar bears kind of thing happening amongst central bankers, but because they were faced with the economic reality. Now, of course, it would be nice if we also cared about the planet, and about our, continued survival and that of other species. But, even if we took that out, the economic reality is driving change. And it's similar on actually the social equity side. As I said before, social unrest isn't good from an economic perspective. And, you know, as a government, you may be, losing your grasp on the social unrest situation, but the pressure that, large firms can put on governments to address those issues, to actually create more stable operating conditions for the firms themselves, which actually means that you have greater equity in society, is not something to be sniffed at. It is actually real. Now, none of us is saying, I think that only market pressures and economic incentives should drive why we do these things. I just find it's really interesting how market pressures and economic incentives are aligning with altruistic reasons for doing some of these things.
Totally true. And can be, as you say, very compelling for those that hold a lot of both power economically as well as politically in our societies. But we have been going on for a while. As you can tell, this is why it's great for Jannah and I to have guests so that we ask questions instead of the two of us just yapping away. However, I want to end on one last question that ChatGPT asked us, which is obviously the name of our podcast comes from E&M Banks's notion of the outside context problem, which hopefully you guys know by now if you've been listening for this long, which is obviously something, it's a paradigm shift. It's something society encounters like a full stop. Now, it asked us after our discussions, what would we identify as the potential biggest outside context problem looming for civilization? And is it something that's like a technological upheaval like AI? Is it more climate breakdown? Or is it something more abstract like the collapse of shared reality or societal functions through misinformation? What do you think, Jannah?
I'm going to mix a load of metaphors here, I'm sure,
I
but
can't wait.
I mean, I think when it comes to the biggest outside context problem, we've been through so many outside context problems. In some way we lurch blindly from one to another. Again, the Industrial Revolution, the advent of personal computers, the internet, all of these things, the iPhone, all of these things changed our lives in massive and unforeseeable ways, and have the potential to create outside context problems. That said, if we look at the outside context problem as being something potentially, civilization ending, I think at the root of it all is AI. I think that, you know, a lot of the things you mentioned there. So yes, climate change is a problem, but the misinformation that can now be spread about climate change and its reality, and the human ability to impact the direction of climate change is a massive risk, and that misinformation and disinformation is enabled and amplified by AI. AI itself is going to be an outside context problem if we actually get to the point of general AI. I think that's going to have consequences that, you know, even the most forward-thinking science fiction authors might not have fully comprehended because of the speed at which they'll happen. It would be relatively, overnight. ChatGPT didn't
Mhm.
happen over 20 years. It literally appeared overnight for most of us. And if we look at social unrest and the rise of populism globally, again, that's fueled by the capabilities of AI and disinformation and misinformation. So I think AI is the outside context challenge that we're dealing with right now. And we might think that it's only going to happen in future, but I think the reality is it's happening now and we're dealing with it now.
I think that's a really good answer. And I won't disagree. So I'll take a slightly different angle on it, which is that I think if we're looking at individual civilizations, so let's go to the jurisdictional level, individual nations, states, the nations. I think that the one I would identify would be to pick up on that last thing you mentioned in terms of like social unrest and division. And I know that that's definitely being fueled at the moment by social media and technology. But to me, it's the one that probably makes me the most sad and scares me the most is that I feel like there's this real division and us and them mentality. And it's not specific to any one jurisdiction. It's popping up in a lot of jurisdictions. And as you say, it's often fueled by misinformation or disinformation. And so I think that that would probably be mine, but I agree with you about AI on a broader global scale. But that being said, I obviously want to leave everybody on a hopeful note, which is that, the whole point of us having this podcast is obviously to talk about these kind of tough, challenging, and scary topics, and also to talk about them for the most part with the real experts who know about these technologies and are also working to solve these challenges. And so I would just say to all of our listeners who have been with us for the past year, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate all of you. I hope that you have found it interesting, a little bit thought-provoking, a little bit challenging. We'd love to hear if you guys have any other outside context moments, but hopefully here's to another year of the outside context.
Here's to another year. And we have absolutely appreciated all of your support and absolutely loved all of your suggestions and introductions to participants on the podcast as well. So please keep those coming. And we look forward to the next episode with you.
Bye.